In your Facebook profile, you can put down your relationship status so everybody can see it. You could write down married or in a relationship or widowed or single, but you're even allowed to put down it's complicated. And I think each one of us, if we search our hearts, if we take stock of our relationships, we have at least one or two relationships that are complicated. I was recently taking stock of some of my online relationships, and I estimate that there are 4 real life relationships in my life over the last 10 years that have become strained because of my willingness to engage in online political and spiritual debate. And it grieves me. And so I have set out to try to reconcile those relationships. And I was successful with one of them. And I think I'm going to be successful with the other 2. And then the 4th one I'm not so sure about. But I think we all have relationships in our lives where we have sorrow, we have regret, we wish it wasn't so complicated. Guess what? David's got a relationship like that with his own kid, with Absalom. Let's see what happens as we continue our study in the life of David in 2 Samuel, as we talk about the holiness of God and how we respond and react to who God is. 2 Samuel chapter 14. Absalom, David's son, has fled to his grandmother's hometown of Geshur. He's banished there, but he wants to come back home. He had murdered David's oldest son, Amnon, his half-brother, and then he fled. Now we'll pick up the action. Verse 1 of chapter 14. Joab, son of Zeruiah, David's nephew, the commander of the army. He knew that the king's heart longed for Absalom. He had been gone in Geshur for 3 years. But I think there's another reason why Joab is about to concoct a plot or a narrative in order to get David to bring Absalom back home. Because the longer Absalom stays away in Geshur, the longer David denies justice to his sister Tamar, I think Absalom is going to get more and more bitter. And I suspect Joab thinks that also. And Joab wants to head this off. He's loyal to David, but he's loyal to David for military and selfish reasons. He wants things to go right, and he knows that Absalom is a threat. And Joab knows the king's heart longs for him. Verse 2, so Joab sent someone to Tekoa and had a wise woman brought from there. He said, pretend you're in mourning. Dress in mourning clothes and don't use any cosmetic lotions. Act like a woman who has spent many days grieving for the dead. Then go to the king and speak these words to him. And Joab put the words in her mouth. When the woman from Tekoa went to the king, she fell with her face to the ground to pay him honor. She said, help me, your majesty. Help me, my lord the king. The king said, what is troubling you? She said, I am a widow. My husband is dead. I, your servant, had 2 sons. Now, keep in mind, this is made-up story. She's acting. They got into a fight with each other in the field, and no one was there to separate them. One struck the other and killed him. By the way, doesn't that remind you of the Cain and Abel story? It certainly does, and that's going to be relevant as we see the resolution of this story. Verse 7, now the whole clan has risen up against your servant. They say, hand over the one who struck his brother down, so that we may put him to death for the life of his brother whom he killed. Then we will get rid of the heir as well. They would put out the only burning coal I have left, leaving my husband neither name nor descendant on the face of the earth. Now, this is very similar to David's story, where his son Absalom murdered and killed his other son Amnon, and he separated from him. But the story is different enough that David might not suspect right away that it's a made-up story designed to get him to comment. They would put out the only burning coal I have left, leaving my husband neither name nor descendant on the face of the earth. Verse 8, the king said to the woman, go home and I will issue an order in your behalf. Now that's exactly what Joab is hoping David would say, that he would show grace. But not enough. Verse 9, the woman from Tekoa said, let my lord the king pardon me and my family, and let the king and his throne be without guilt. The king replied, if anyone says anything to you, bring them to me, and they won't bother you again. Verse 11, she said, let the king invoke the Lord his God to prevent the avenger of blood from adding to the destruction, so that my son will not be destroyed. Because when somebody in the family is killed, an avenger of blood, a lawyer in defense of the one killed, is allowed to rise up and get justice against the one who committed the crime. And she's saying, don't let that happen. This is my only son. Yeah, he killed my other son, but I don't want to lose both my sons. I mean, she's ignoring what the Torah says about justice, right? Because doesn't Exodus 21 verse 12 say anyone who attacks somebody else and kills them should be put to death? And doesn't Genesis 9:6 say whoever sheds the blood of man, by man should his blood be shed? For in the image of God is God made man. So she's not asking for justice because that would mean he would die. She's asking for grace and mercy. And David says at the end of verse 11, you can have it. As surely as the Lord lives, he said, not one hair of your son's head will fall to the ground. All right. And now she's going to respond to David by saying, well, what about you? This is very bold. Verse 12, the woman said, let your servant speak a word to my lord the king. Speak, he replied. The woman said, why then have you devised a thing like this against the people of God? When the king says this, does he not convict himself? For the king has not brought back his banished son. Like water spilled on the ground, which can't be recovered, so we must die. But that is not what God desires. Rather, he devises ways so that a banished person does not remain banished from him. That's one of the great gospel verses of the Old Testament. We all deserve to die. Yeah, Absalom deserves to die for what he did. Just like Cain in Genesis 4 deserved to die for what he did. The Torah even says death penalty for the one who kills. But sometimes God shows grace. Sometimes, like with David, he deserved to die. In 2 Samuel 11, and Nathan said, the Lord has taken away your sin. You're not going to die. God showed grace to you. Will you show grace to your son Absalom? Now, the only problem here is that David was really, really lenient with Amnon, and he didn't do anything to punish Amnon after he raped his half-sister Tamar. And now David's acting the opposite. He's acting all strict with Absalom, keeping him banished for 3 years with Geshur. And sometimes that can happen with parents. When they're not strict enough with their kids when at the very beginning, they try to overcompensate by being more strict later, and then the kids are provoked to wrath. And that's what's happening with Absalom. He's getting all bitter and worked up, and you know, look how long he waited before he killed his brother Absalom in the last chapter. He was willing to wait 2 years. He stewed and chewed and mooed for 2 years before he killed his brother Amnon. And now for 3 years, he's stewing and mooing and chewing in Geshur, mad at his father. And he's going to get revenge on his father. He's going to try for revenge in chapters 15, 16, 17, and 18. The story's going to continue. But here, the woman, through Joab, is trying to help David and not make this situation come to rise. And she was successful. David Guzik says several factors made this woman and her appeal successful. Number one, she was a widow, which would invite sympathy. She was acting as a widow, but it invited sympathy. Number two, she lived at some distance from Jerusalem and Tekoa, so you couldn't check into her story so easily. Number three, she was old, which gave more dignity to the story. Number four, she wore the clothes of mourning, which created pathos and emotion. And number five, she brought a case of family estrangement to David, and David could empathize because there's estrangement in his family. And six, she brought a case that was not too similar, lest it arouse David's suspicions. So David realizes that he needs to be consistent, and he needs to either show grace or he needs to show judgment. He's the judge of the country. He needs to do what is right. So David says to the woman in verse 18, "Don't keep from me the answer to what I'm going to ask you." The woman said, "Let my lord the king speak." The king asked, "Isn't the hand of Joab with you in all this?" The king knows Joab. They're related. He's the uncle of Joab, and David knows that he's the one responsible for this. Verse 19, the woman answered, "As surely as you live, my lord the king, no one can turn to the right or the left from anything my lord the king says." Yes, it was Joab who instructed me to do this, and who put all these words into the mouth of your servant. Your servant Joab did this to change the present situation. You know, Joab was thinking from a military perspective. Absalom is not only the crown prince, but he's a threat to the kingdom right now. We need to appease him. We need to bring him back. And also, he's popular in Israel. And so Joab is thinking of both military and political instincts, with regard to this. And then the woman says to David, "Man, you're amazing for figuring this out. My Lord has wisdom like that of an angel of God. He knows everything that happens in the land." The king said to Joab, "Very well, I will do it. Go bring back the young man Absalom." So Joab must have been hiding in the back of the room. Verse 22, Joab fell with his face to the ground to pay him honor, and he blessed the king. Joab said, "Today your servant knows that he has found favor in your eyes, my lord the king, because the king has granted his servant's request." Verse 23, then Joab went to Geshur and brought Absalom back to Jerusalem. But the king said, "He must go to his own house. He must not see my face." So Absalom went to his own house and did not see the face of the king. So this is not a complete reconciliation. This is at best a partial reconciliation. Okay, David didn't put Absalom to death for murdering Amnon. He showed grace to him, just as Nathan said God showed grace to David. David could have been put to death for killing Uriah the Hittite. God showed grace. David could have put Absalom to death, and he didn't. God showed grace. But he punished Absalom by banishing him for 3 years, whereas he didn't do anything to Amnon. And now that Absalom is back home again, David is still punishing him. You're grounded. You're staying in your house, man. I don't want to see your face. And so Absalom has more time to stew and chew and moo and get mad. Here's something else. Look at verse 25. In all Israel, there was not a man so highly praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the top of his head to the sole of his foot, there was no blemish in him. Whenever he cut the hair of his head, he used to cut his hair once a year because it became too heavy for him. He would weigh it, and its weight was 200 shekels by the royal standard. Holy cow, that's like 5 pounds. I can't imagine hair even being 1 pound. Now, this guy had very, very thick hair. Oh my goodness. And now we get a glimpse as to why Israel falls in love with Absalom. He's so good looking. That's why, same thing with King Saul. He was a big, strong, good looking guy, so they fell in love with King Saul. But remember what 1 Samuel 16 verse 7 says? Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Absalom doesn't have near the heart for the people that David does. And we're going to see here in just a moment what kind of a evil man Absalom really is. So Absalom is liked because of the way he looks. Verse 27, 3 sons and a daughter were born to Absalom, and his daughter's name was Tamar. He named his daughter after his sister, and she became a beautiful woman. That's kind of a touching note. Verse 28, Absalom lived 2 years in Jerusalem without seeing the king's face. So 3 years banished in Geshur, and now 2 years banished in his own home in Jerusalem. So it's 5 years. 5-year punishment, and David didn't do anything when Amnon raped Tamar. And now David's going to all of a sudden start acting like a good dad and being all strict and stuff when he was lenient for all them years, letting kids get away with murder. And now he's going to act all tough. You know, you can see Absalom. Verse 29, then Absalom sent for Joab in order to send him to the king, but Joab refused to come to him. He sent the second time, but he refused to come. You know, Joab's probably like, I don't want to mess with this guy right now. I'm busy. I've got an army to command. Verse 30, Absalom said to his servants, look, Joab's field is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire. So Absalom's servants set the field on fire. So Absalom is like a little kid who's angry that he thinks he's being ignored, and so he's going to set his neighbor's field on fire. That's what this is. And that shows you how selfish and evil Absalom is. Verse 31, then Joab did go to Absalom's house, and he said to him, why have your servants set my field on fire? Absalom said, look, I sent word to you and said, come here so I can send you to the king to ask, why have I come from Geshur? It would have been better for me if I were still there. Now that I want to see the king's face, and if I'm guilty of anything, let him put me to death. Notice he doesn't call David my father. He calls him the king. You know, there's already that complicated relationship problems. He won't even call him dad. There have been times where I visited people and I was talking to the person's son, and the son called the dad by their first name rather than dad. And, you know, maybe that's their thing. It bothered me, though. It bothers me when people don't call their dad dad. I know, Mark, it's none of your business, but it does bother me. And this guy's not calling his dad dad. He's calling him the king. There's that complicated distance going on. So Joab went to the king and told him this. And before that, he said, Absalom said, I want to see the king's face, and if I'm guilty of anything, let him put me to death. Well, dude, you've already experienced grace because you do deserve death. Verse 33, so Joab went to the king and told him this. Then the king summoned Absalom, and he came in and bowed down with his face to the ground before the king. And the king kissed Absalom. All right, so there's the outward show of affection. Absalom bows down, and the king kisses Absalom. but there's nothing mentioned, no discussion at all about what happened. David should have said, you know what, Absalom, I was wrong. I was too lenient with Amnon. I let him run wild. I never counseled him on self-control. What he did was wrong, and I should have punished him. And I am so sorry for not being a good father. I was too busy trying to be a good king and not spending enough time trying to be a good father. And also, I felt a little guilty. I mean, I wasn't a very good husband. I accumulated many wives. I committed adultery and had the woman's husband murdered. I feel like I'm not worthy, and so that has something to do with it too. You know, David should have opened up, and then Absalom should have said, yeah, I was bitter. You know, I was like, how could you let Amnon for 2 years get away with raping my sister? And I flew off the handle, and I just couldn't take it no more. I had devised a plan to be the avenger of blood and get rid of Amnon. And I let all that bitterness, and I was bitter at you the last 5 years. I am so sorry. It would have been great if they would have had that conversation. But instead, David kissed him and said, you know, you can leave now. Life Application Bible's got some interesting notes on this chapter. Thought I would share them. What can we learn from this terrible story? Even the highest ranking and best equipped people are sinners and rebels at heart. We must guard our own hearts against sin. Number 2, David failed to teach his children God's ways. Even if our children are raised in church, we must teach and exemplify character and obedience to God. Number 3, David was preoccupied with government, wives, and concubines. He failed to act decisively to correct the evil in his family. At times, his guilt about his own sin caused him to avoid disciplining his sons caught in similar sins. We must make every attempt to break the cycles of hatred and lust. Well, that's really good. So it's complicated sometimes, but here is my word of instruction. This is how we can apply this lesson. I want you to take stock of your life. And I want you to see, are there any relationships in my life that are strained because there was something I should have done and I didn't do? Or is there something I did and I shouldn't have done it? Or something I said and I shouldn't have said it? Or something I should have said and didn't say it? Is there anything in my life like that? And God, if it's your will, I want to go to that person and make peace before it turns into a David-Absalom civil war situation. That's what's going to happen here. This is going to turn into a civil war. This is going to blow up because David and Absalom never had that conversation. Find those people in your life that you need to make peace with. How do I know you should do that? Jesus said in Matthew 5:9, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. Romans 12:18, if it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Galatians 5:22, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Jesus says in John 14:27, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Ephesians 2:14, he himself is our peace. You know, Jesus became our peace. He made peace between us and God when he died on the cross for our sins and rose again. So receive Christ as Lord and Savior and be at peace with God through Jesus, and then make peace with people in your life. Jesus loves you. This I know, for the Bible tells me so. All right, next week I'm going to be teaching Vacation Bible School all week long, so I'm not going to be able to continue with 2 Samuel in the morning. I'm debating whether or not to have evening classes. I'm going to see about that. I'll leave a note on Facebook regarding times for next week. You guys take care and have a wonderful week, and God bless.